So here in this lecture video, we're going to look at Xunzi's conception of fixation and how this is meant to be undone by moral education. So Xunzi lived approximately 310 to 238 BCE. He is known as a kind of unorthodox Confucian philosopher, and in many ways then he sees himself as contrasting his interpretation of Confucius with that of Mengzi. Now, Xunzi says, a virtuous person is exceptional not by birth, but rather by being good at making use of things. I think this, in a way, almost sums up Xunzi's approach to Confucian philosophy. Right? The idea is that moral goodness is achieved by shaping oneself. Right? It is not that one is good by birth, but it is that an individual cultivates their surroundings, cultivates themselves as a person. And Xunzi is going to use many different kinds of metaphors or things, examples involving wood or water or metal or other things like that, and the ways in which they can be shaped into things. Now, first the question is, where then does learning, and specifically learning of the virtues, becoming a morally good person, where does this begin and end? So what is its purpose, right? What is the goal that should be achieved in moral education? So Xunzi says, its order begins with reciting the classics and ends with studying ritual, right? So in one way, it begins with the kind of culture and learning of culture one grows up in, but also a specific studying of how that culture and the habits and the customs exist and the purposes of them, such that one can then master them. So he says its purpose begins with becoming a well-bred man and ends with becoming a sage. If you truly accumulate effort for a long time, then you will advance. Learning proceeds until death, and only then does it stop. And so the order of learning has a stopping point, but its purpose cannot be given up for even a moment. To pursue it is to be human. To give it up is to be a beast. So what makes a human being a human is the desire to learn, the desire to become morally good, right? And what's interesting about this is it means that this takes an entire lifetime to master, that one can always learn, of course, new things. Now, the sage, of course, masters the virtues, but they're still learning, right? Still learning new ways to apply the virtues, although, of course, their mastering of the virtues means they know what the right thing is to do, but they're always going to, encounter new experiences because they're a human being, right? That's what it means to be a human being. Now, the way, or the Tao, is kind of like the good. So the good is that which is perfect. So the way is that which is perfect, and it serves as a kind of a measuring stick for all actions, determining whether an action was virtuous or not. So one then studies the way, or the good, right? Because the good is that which determines whether an action is good or not. Once you learn what the way is, then you know always what it is to be a good person. So Xunzi says, one who misses a single shot out of 100 does not deserve to be called good at archery. One who falls short of going 1,000 li by the distance of even half a step does not deserve to be called good at chariot driving. One who does not fully comprehend the proper kinds and classes of things, or who is not single-minded in pursuit of ren and yi, right, so of benevolence and justice, does not deserve to be called good at learning. Perfect it and complete it, and only then is one truly a learned person. So the idea here is that one can, of course, compare many different things, and they can say, hey, look, winning a race by, or let's say running a mile in 20 minutes is, of course, better than running a mile in 30 minutes, we'll say. That's a long time, but still, right? And so someone then might come along and run a mile in 15 minutes, right? And we would say, wow, that person's really good at running. But in what way, right? Well, clearly, with that example, the person that ran the mile in 15 minutes, they are good at running as compared to all those other people who finished, in 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever else, right? But if that's the case, then everything that we mean by being good is just comparative. It's, in that sense, relative, right? So if we just learn, or if we just know whether something is good or not in terms of its relation to all other things, then that means ultimately the good is relative, and there is no a truly good thing. And there is no one thing that is truly good. There's no one thing that you can know whether or not the action you performed is good, because it can always be overturned, right, by coming across someone else who did something better. So the point here is then, the good or the way is that single source, right, of goodness that determines whether something is truly good or not, right? And so we know, right, to be truly good at archery is to never miss your target. Now we might say, in a sense, right, the person who makes 99 out of 100 shots is good, right? But they're not really, they're not good in like a capital G sense at archery. In a way, they have not perfected the art of archery. So the way, then, is the study of moral goodness, right? To be good is not to do mostly, moral actions. It is to always perform moral actions, right? Now, we might say, again, in some kind of conventional sense, we might say the person who is mostly good, maybe sometimes they lie, but it's only for small reasons, or, whatever else, right? Like, we might say that person's good, but they're not truly good, right? They're not, for example, a moral sage, one who never errs in their actions, one who is always moral. So the way is that, again, measuring stick in a sense. So the sage then, once someone becomes a sage, once someone masters the way, they have achieved what Xunzi calls fixity. Achieving fixity means one is stable in the virtues and the way. They no longer have to question whether the action they have done was good or wrong, right? And one might want to, in learning the way, of course, look at the different ways that people approach different contexts, right? So one can learn by comparison. But the sage no longer does that. The sage knows immediately, right? Upon command, on hand, they know what the right thing is to do and what the wrong thing is. So Xunzi says, when virtue has been grasped, only then can one achieve fixity. When one can achieve fixity, only then can one respond to things. To be capable of both fixity and responding to things, this is called the perfected person. So, as discussed, for example, in the Mengzi, right, qi is important because you need to cultivate surroundings which facilitate the ability to learn what are the right actions one should perform, right? Ways in which they don't tempt you to do immoral things. Now, what is also needed is a cultivation of one's mind, such that one has a kind of moral clarity, right? So it's not just that human beings, of course, are, inanimate objects that can be fully determined. In this sense, right, there's a role for the mind to reflect on one's actions and to think about, maybe I should have done something in the past, right, and to learn from it. And this, of course, then reinforces qi in the same way that, qi reinforces the nourishing of the heart or the mind. Now, what this requires then is if qi is that which helps facilitate, right, the practicing of the virtues, a teacher helps guide your mind to learn how to then become more virtuous. So to morally cultivate one's character, one has to have not only qi, right, and so good ritual, good practices that one can follow, but a teacher as well. So ritual, Xunzi says, is that by which to correct your person. So it is that where you can imagine you kind of, something becomes like second nature, right? In the same way that, like, if you play sports, maybe you practice the same play over and over and over. Why do you do that? muscle memory, so you don't have to think about it. But the teacher is that by which to correct your practice of ritual. So it's not just enough that you by yourself, practice a play over and over. You have a coach that watches you and says, "Hey, when you practice that play, there's something you're doing wrong, right? You could do this, whatever it may be, better, right? And that's going to improve your ability to execute the play." So Xunzi says, the methods for controlling the qi and nourishing the heart. For unyielding blood and qi, soften them with harmoniousness. For overly deep thinking, simplify it with easy goodness. For overly ferocious courage, reform it with proper compliance. For expedience-seeking hastiness, restrain it with regulated movements. For small-minded narrowness, broaden it with expansiveness. For excessive humility, sluggishness, or greed for profit, resist it with lofty intentions. For vulgarity or dissoluteness, expunge it with teachers and friends. For indolence and profligacy, illuminate it with the prospect of disasters. For simple-minded rectitude or scrupulous honesty, make it suitable with ritual and music, and enlighten it with reflection. Now, in a way, right, this serves as a kind of handbook to follow. And I mean, the Xunzi as a whole should be seen as a kind of handbook to follow, that at certain times one can go back through it and reflect on, some of these, in a way, I wouldn't say hints, right? But points that one should think about and reflect on and say, okay, have I been too greedy, right? If so, what could I do to help address my greediness, right? And here's something that Xunzi says, which is, well, to help resist your greediness, resist it with lofty intentions. So maybe you have intentions that are, so high, right, that this causes you to be, more greedy, so you lower your intentions on what you want to achieve. And hopefully then you'll get used to, maybe smaller pleasures, right, which will prevent your desire for profit, for example, right? And hopefully over time lead you to become less greedy, right? And this is the case with all the other different examples which Xunzi is stating. Now, why, again, right, this is similar to the question that was asked of Mengzi, why is it, for Mengzi, even if people are morally good, you have so many people, their nature is morally good, but you have so many people that actually aren't morally good. A bit similar, but Xunzi is not assuming that people are morally good. The question is, why do most people not attain virtue? Right? What prevents them from becoming morally good? Xunzi's answer is that they become fixated on what he calls one twist, and are deluded about the greater order of things. Now, what this twist is they become fixated on one interpretation of the way, of the Tao. So they come to think that there's one specific way one has to act in order to become good, and they dismiss all the other interpretations one can have of a moral context, right? And so they become fixated, right, in a way where it's they become attached to one conception of the good. So he says, they selfishly favor the approach in which they have accumulated effort and only fear to hear it disparaged. They rely on it when regarding other approaches and only fear to hear those others praised. Therefore, they depart further and further from getting under control, and they think they are right not to stop. There's almost a kind of a feedback loop here, right? So a bit similar to Buddhism, right, with the problem of desire and attachment. Here in this case, one person becomes fixated on a certain conception of the way, and some of those different ways of fixation, according to Xunzi, are, for example, desires or dislikes. So this can be taken two different ways. One, we can think of this as a kind of hedonism, right? That the way in which one is good is to maximize pleasure. If you maximize pleasure, you're living the good life, morally speaking, right? Or maybe being focused on desires, or in this case, dislikes, right? Is being focused on preventing suffering due to desires. So this would be a criticism of Buddhism. Or perhaps on origins or ends. So this could say that, well, consequentialism in general, right? Just the idea that actions are right insofar as they have the best outcomes, whatever those outcomes might be determined to be, or any kind of like focus on a teleology perhaps, or even origins. If we say origins, right? So a focus on intentions, that as long as one's intention is good, then one's action is morally right. Or what is far or nearby. So in this case, it might be saying that like, well, altruism is the only correct approach to morality, or being selfishness, a kind of egoism could be correct, or maybe even like a kind of like filial morality, that one should always do whatever is in the best interest of one's family or friends or something like that, as opposed to someone else, right? In these other cases, broad learning or narrowness, ancient past or the present. I actually don't, I'm not entirely sure who, if there's a specific philosopher he has in mind for these last two. But, right, so the idea is that all these different philosophers and the philosophies they promote are kind of like looking at one interpretation of the way. And what Xunzi is, of course, saying is, being a virtue ethicist, you realize different situations call for different actions. Sometimes it might be the case that what is good is what reduces suffering. But sometimes what you need to do is maybe cause suffering, like maybe with an example of what's called tough love, right? So you teach a lesson for the sake of the good intention, right? And there can be many, other cases, right? Which is what virtue ethics is concerned with, is the specific context and the way in which one should act morally, right? And so because of this, there's no ready-made rule that one can just consult, like a guidebook on how to be moral. This requires the cultivation of practical wisdom here, right? And the problem is, all these different philosophies for Xunzi, they become attached and think that their one conception of the way is right, such that they dismiss all the other ways, and in this way they fail to become truly moral. So if one speaks of the way then in only a single way, then one will limit their knowledge of the way. So it's not only the case that one is being immoral by thinking of the way in only a single way, but it's also the case that they're limiting the amount of knowledge, right? So epistemology is attached to practical wisdom or moral knowledge, just in general, right? For Xunzi and the Confucians. So Xunzi says, thus, if one speaks of it in terms of usefulness, then the way will consist completely in seeking what is profitable. If one speaks of it in terms of desires, then the way will consist completely in learning to be satisfied. If one speaks of it in terms of laws, then the way will consist completely in making arrangements. If one speaks of it in terms of power, then the way will consist completely in finding what is expedient. If one speaks of it in terms of wording, then the way will consist completely in discoursing on matters. If one speaks of it in terms of the heavenly, then the way will consist completely in following along with things. These various approaches are all merely one corner of the way. As for the way itself, its substance is constant, yet it covers all changes. No one corner is sufficient to exhibit it fully. In a way, this is a kind of pluralism, that there can be more than one kind of good, right? So, and we can see as well in each of these cases, there are specific people that that Xunzi has in mind of like who his target is. So, of course, those who speak in terms of usefulness, consequentialists. So this could be a Buddhist, this could be a Moist. In terms of following along with the heavenly. In mind, likely, he has Zhuangzi and Taoism in general, or the legalists when he talks about the laws. So he's picking fights with specific philosophers. Although I should say it's not the case that he has in mind the Buddhists, right? At this point in time, there's no good evidence of like serious contact between Buddhism and these early Confucians. But he definitely, we can see this as a critique of Buddhism. Now, how does one then overcome, right, or undo fixation, right, and achieve fixity, right? So don't confuse those two, fixity and fixation. Fixity is having understood how to grasp the way, right, and being still in the grasp in the understanding of the way, and being fixated or having fixation is only grasping the way in one particular way and not understanding the full knowledge of the way. So how then does one undo fixity or fixation? For Xunzi, he says, you make emptiness, single-mindedness, and stillness one's principles. So emptiness, right? You try to remain neutral on whether or not one has to essentialize the way and say there's just one definition with which you can give the way. Right? There is no one definition of what the way is, which is why Xunzi doesn't offer one, Mengzi doesn't offer one. And that's why this requires education, moral education, and experience to learn, right? All the different contexts in which the way can be applied. So this achieves non-fixation, emptiness. Now, stillness achieves non-fixation by being calm, right, in one's mind, and not being quick to judgment in terms of wanting to execute a specific conception of the good or the way. So this is similar to emptiness, but in this case it has to do with a calmness of the mind, and this involves maturity, right? So this requires one to have enough life experience. Now, what about single-mindedness? Now, this seems like it would be a case of fixation. How is single-mindedness not fixation? Well, single-mindedness, at least in the way that Xunzi means it, it's not fixation. It is non-fixation, because what he means by single-mindedness is a clarity where one is focused on the way and focused on grasping the way in all of the ways in which the way manifests itself. So he says, one who is an expert in regard to things merely measures one thing against another, right? And this is what we want to avoid, is not being an expert in this kind of conventional way. One who is expert in regard to the way measures all things together. Thus, the gentleman pursues the way single-mindedly and uses it to guide and oversee things. So, by being single-minded, that means one only uses the way as that thing of which you judge all other things. So, although the mind must grasp the way, right, again, this requires crafting by ritual and education. So, here's an example, or a kind of metaphor that Xunzi gives. So, Xunzi says, the human heart can be compared to a pan of water. If you set it straight and do not move it, the muddy and turbid parts will settle to the bottom, and the clear and bright parts will be on the top. And then one can see one's whiskers and inspect the lines on one's face. But if a slight breeze passes over it, the muddy and turbid parts will be stirred up from the bottom, and the clear and bright parts will be disturbed on the top. And then one cannot get a correct view of even large contours. The heart is just like this. Thus, if one guides it with good order, nourishes it with clarity, and nothing can make it deviate, then it will be capable of determining right and wrong and deciding what is doubtful. If it is drawn aside by even a little thing, then on the outside one's correctness will be altered, and on the inside one's heart will deviate, and then will be capable of discerning the multifarious patterns of things, right? So the ways in which moral problems appear in our actual life, and the ways in which, again, right, there's a plurality of possibilities of moral problems arising, and therefore there are a plurality of answers that can be given. But the moral sage always knows what the right thing is to do, and it never changes. The context may change, and so different actions might be required, but if two sages, right, are confronted in that same context with the exact same problem, everything else remaining the same, they would say exactly what the right thing is to do, and it would be the same thing. This can only be achieved by cultivating qi, by following, of course, ritual, by learning ritual, mastering ritual, and by having a teacher, someone who can help guide one's heart, one's mind, to morally mature and be able to approach moral problems in accordance with the way. So, order and goodness resides in the heart or in the mind, right? Which is why, again, practical wisdom is so important, and not in desires. So again, right, this can be another way in which Xunzi could attack Buddhism, a way in which we can see this as attacking Buddhism. So it makes no sense to tie goodness to the minimization or elimination of desires. He says, all those who say that good order must await the elimination of desires are people who lack the means to guide desire and cannot handle the mere having of desires. All those who say good order must await the lessening of desires are people who lack the means to restrain desire and cannot handle the abundance of desires. Having desires and lacking desires fall under two kinds, namely being alive and being dead, not order and disorder. Having many desires and having few desires also fall under different kinds, namely the number of people's dispositions, not order and disorder. So here, on the one hand, right, we can see this as attacking Buddhism, because of course Buddhism says that the goal is to of course overcome suffering, and suffering is caused by desire. But on the other hand, he's also attacking Mengzi, because Mengzi said one wants to minimize as many desires as one can. Right? The fewer desires one has, the more, the better one can be as a moral individual. But Xunzi is saying that's ridiculous. The problem is not desires. Desires are not the source of immoral behavior. The source of immoral behavior is the mind. It's the intentions one cultivates. So it's the kinds of desires one wants to have. But the fact is, for Xunzi, to overcome bad desires, you have to desire good desires. So it's not about minimizing or even eliminating desires altogether, because as Xunzi just said, right, part of what it means to be a human being is to have desires, such that if one no longer has desires, one might as well be dead. What one needs to do is cultivate the ability to only desire good things. So order and disorder reside inside what the heart or mind approves of and are not present in the dispositions of one's desires. That is why moral education focuses on, again, practical wisdom and not merely, in this case, right, the possession of desires in general.